There is absolutely no way that you can look at the Bible or the history of the church and think that there is, I think, even an embryo, the idea of something like our modern conception of gender equality that's indebted to a feminist movement, to a Judeo-Christian tradition, which has this sort of, which is totally okay with human sacrifice. The famous story of Abraham and Isaac, of course, Abraham doesn't sacrifice Isaac in the end, but it's the willingness to commit, and indeed, the sacrifice of his own child.
That's not the world that the Bible describes.
I agree. I think it depends how you're reading it, right? If you're reading it as a Christian, of course, that's how you're going to read it. What I'm saying is it's too simplistic an approach. I'm demonstrating the simplicity in my very own approach there.
Why don't we start with compassion? Your book deals with about 7 different topics, but compassion, I think, is one of the easiest to get a grasp on because there are some very specific ways, examples you give of the way that the early Christians inculcated what you believe are the kinds of values around kindness and compassion that we now take for granted. But maybe sketch out that and then we'll see what Alex has to say.
Yeah, well, let me begin where Dominion begins with the cross, and in my book I talk about imagining myself into the shoes or into the sandals of a Roman centurion at the foot of the cross. And you really are dealing in a world of a very steep hierarchy of dominance, in which the slaves are absolutely at the bottom and the slave's death is the extreme penalty. And who should show up on that cross but the God of heaven? And it's the Jews in particular who are proclaiming that God has shown up on this cross, and of all the people to say the word God, you know, they're saying it with a weight that goes far beyond anything that the Romans were used to. And here is the great story that, according to Scripture, according to believers, you know, here is the highest figure descending to the deepest depths, to have the greatest effect on the most number of people for the longest duration. Here is an unimprovable story of compassion, because I think, naturally speaking, it is survival of the fittest, and therefore the weakest are cast off. And here is the sacrifice of the fittest for we the weakest, so that we the weakest might survive and thrive and pass on a compassion revolution. And I think it really was a compassion revolution. Theresa Morgan often notes that a very common aphorism back in Roman times was, every day do something to help your friends and harm your enemies. And we all resonate with the first half of that, and the second half we go, yikes, you know. And we distance ourselves from that second half, but I think that second half makes perfect sense. In a brutal world of scarcity, it makes perfect sense in an evolutionary frame. If you're just thinking about in-group amity and out-group enmity, it seems to perfectly describe nature in that sense. And that's why Nietzsche called this the transvaluation of all values, that you have the highest figure descending to the deepest depth in order to have compassion on us. And it birthed a compassion revolution in people who are taking that story very, very seriously. And things like charity, the way we think of charity today, hospitals, the way we think of hospitals today, orphan care that you've already mentioned, the way that we think of orphan care today, and then the abolition of things like the gladiatorial games, or the abolition of pederasty, the abolition of infanticide, and absolutely on the statute books, the first people ever to outlaw this practice it's close to a human universal. You know, Tacitus, you know, speaks of some German tribes that don't kill their offspring, and that was remarkable to him. But exposing infants, largely girls, the disabled, was just a very common practice. And now I
just explain what exposing means for those who perhaps aren't familiar with the terminology.
Right, leaving them in a rubbish dump to die of exposure or be taken by dogs, or putting them down a well, or drowning them in rivers, killing them. And I think there's an example of a moral intuition that has gone from, certainly it might be grubby, it might be unfortunate, it can be explicable and excused, though, in a sort of a Roman frame as in a time of scarcity, this is, you know, needs must. But I don't think any of those kind of I don't think any of those justifications fly with us nowadays. And I don't think Rome itself was going to bring any of those reforms about under its own steam, given its own kind of moral and spiritual resources. I think it's definitely Christianity that has brought those about. And there is an example, I think, of some compassionate moral intuitions that ground themselves in some moral progress. And it is certainly Christians who are at the forefront of that.
Okay. Thoughts, Alex?
Well, there's a lot to say, right? I mean, like I say, I don't want to the sin I think both sides, as it were, commit on this issue is, I think, an overemphasis, is to say that in the same way that you might say exposure in the ancient world, it does seem to be that we have records of Christians being the ones who are sort of anti this, who are sort of the antidote to exposure. And of course, yeah, happy to grant that. I just don't want to overstep the influence of Christianity in particular over the entire development of the Western tradition. In the same way, I might want to talk about the way that the church has stood in the way of a number of important instances of progress towards the West today. And I don't mean moral progress in an objective sense. I just mean movement from where it was to where it is. But you then wouldn't want me to overstep and say, therefore, the church has been, the greatest roadblock and Christianity is evil and terrible. So I just don't want to overstate the case. My biggest problem with Christianity as responsible for these developments is its attachment to Judaism, to the extent that in the early church, Marcion famously thought that the God of the Old Testament could not be the same God of Jesus. He produces this text called the Antithesis, where he compares the doings, the sayings and doings of the Old Testament God and Jesus, and says these cannot be the same kind of person. And as long as you've got this attachment to this Jewish tradition, I find it very difficult to square how you have these kinds of condemnations that Christianity, allows people to have of Roman practices, without them similarly indicting the God that I'm told is the God that sort of came down into the figure of Jesus. They sort of have this excusability with the Jewish God. Now, you might say that the very means by which they're able to look at the Jewish God and say these are things that trouble me and things I don't like, is essentially Christian. But if that's the case, then you're kind of left with a paradox as to what you're talking about when it comes to Christian values. If you want to agree with what I'm saying, which is that those are still present in the Old Testament, then you kind of become a bit of a Marcionite in saying that, well, the only thing that matters is Jesus. We can just kind of ignore the Old Testament, say that was wrong and that doesn't matter. Or if you need to own it and not be a Marcionite, not be a heretic, then you need to offer an account for how that wasn't wrong when Yahweh was doing it. And how, it's okay for Jesus to enter into that world and not be seen as this sort of, fundamental negation of the Jewish religion. Whereas when he does it for the Romans, it's a negation as well. Also, it's quite easy to pick on specific examples. For example, why do the Romans invade Gaul? We have Julius Caesar's own words as to why he invaded Gaul. What are some of the reasons? Do we know? Well, one reason he gives is that the people there essentially are practicing human sacrifice. He includes this as one of the things that these people do, which, it sort of carries some of the justification for invading. Now, of course, in his heart of hearts, Julius Caesar probably just wanted Gaul for himself, but he at least appealed to this notion. Now, I could easily say, look, there is this, popular Judeo-Christian tradition, which has this sort of, which is totally okay with human sacrifice. The famous story of Abraham and Isaac, of course, Abraham doesn't sacrifice Isaac in the end, but it's the willingness to commit, and indeed the sacrifice of his own child, in reverence to this sort of strange ancient philosophical belief that they had, which we would never recognize today, that you should sacrifice your own children on behalf of your philosophical convictions. Also in Exodus chapter 22, verse 29, there's this very strange injunction to sacrifice your children to God, which is immediately renegotiated, where God says, as with the lamb. Please.
Christianity cannot take full credit for Western compassion while ignoring the parts of its own scripture that clash with it. The Bible regulates slavery in Exodus 21, commands the destruction of whole cities in Deuteronomy 20, and says the firstborn belongs to God in Exodus 22:29. So when Christians condemn Roman cruelty, they still have to explain why similar violence and hierarchy appear in their own sacred text. That is a serious problem for the claim that Christianity gave us moral progress.
Pull it up. And there's a lot of debate about exactly what that means. Some people think that this actually would be an instance of you will I forget the term, but you sacrifice someone else in their place, but on the 8th day, you give your firstborn to the Lord, as you do with animals as well. While you're looking at that, I'll give you another example, because that one's a bit more controversial, but I could easily point to it, especially as an ancient reader looking back and saying, like, look at what was present there. Of course, Christianity itself is predicated on a human sacrifice, which is the sacrifice of Jesus. Now, I could say, look at this strange intuition that nobody thought, nobody seems to sort of have a qualm with this kind of thing. Of course, in some Old Testament passages, Israel does end up having a qualm with human sacrifice. I think that's a renegotiation of the principle. But I could say, but look, then you have this Roman tradition, which looks at the human sacrifice of the Gauls and says, no, that's terrible, we're going to invade and we're going to civilize them. And say, see, so the sort of respect for the sanctity of humans and the abolition of human sacrifice, we're really indebted to the Romans for that. I think that would just be a bit too simple. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it absolutely would. And this is why...
Did you find the verse?
Yeah. Are you talking about Exodus 22:29?
Maybe I've got the verse wrong. What does that say?
Exodus 22:29. You shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses.
That can't be it. What's
The
next?
firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. 7 days shall be with his mother. On the 8th day.
On the 8th day,
On the 8th day you shall give it to me.
the firstborn, in the same way that you do with the oxen and the sheep. So
But they were ransomed, and I don't know what the price was, but that was the cost of that life was given towards the temple as money.
well, that's what they say. But in that particular instance, it's
Even within Exodus,
you're
that's
doing
true.
elsewhere in Exodus.
Elsewhere, okay.
Let's not get caught up on that verse. There's some.
Well, no, but
this
is my issue with. I think you're going to the Bible in a way that's alien to the way that anybody has ever gone to the Bible. Like to go into a verse and take out of it as a timeless principle that stands by itself and probably could cause somebody to kill their son. It's just not the way. I mean, Christians, that they don't read their Bibles that way. You must know Christian history. You know that that's not the way that Christendom has read the Bible in that way. So what are you right about reading the Bible that way? And the rest of
what I'm doing is I'm showing it's a bit too simple to do this, right? Like I'm trying to demonstrate, because obviously the sort of approach that I'm taking here, you will see as illegitimate, and I think is illegitimate to some degree. I think it's got some
even within Exodus, but
yes. But then Exodus is a series of sort of renegotiations over scriptural history. I mean, I'm not the first person to think that particular verse is an instance of command for human sacrifice that survives into the biblical tradition that is then renegotiated. Scholars, debated, of course. But what I'm saying is, I could do that, but I think it would be too lazy. What we need to do is look at the overall picture that we get from these stories. What is the picture that we get from reading the Old Testament and this God? And what is the picture that we get of Jesus and his relationship to that God?
That might be a helpful place
and where
to
does
go
that give us these ideas of compassion and equality?
So I mean, the big picture thing, without getting into the weeds of the Exodus thing, and I understand.
And you're going to go to the first page of the Bible, which I think might actually be the second page of the Bible.
Okay. I'm actually going to go to Genesis 22.
Oh,
I was going to go to Abraham and Isaac. A wonderful proclamation.
All right, let's go there, and then we'll look at the bigger picture.
I mean, so the whole issue is Abraham is promised a seed. He and Sarah are totally childless. And after barrenness, miraculously, they finally have a son. He is the seed of Abraham, which is utterly messianic terms. He is the heir of the cosmos, the hope of the world. Here is this child. And then God goes and tested Abraham and says, Abraham, and he said to him, here I am, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah. Mount Moriah is where the temple is, so a mountain in the region of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, even within Genesis, you're thinking, but he's the hope of the world. He's the heir of the cosmos. He's the seed of Abraham. And he's being told to be sacrificed, and somehow through that sacrifice, what? Because the whole world is going to be blessed through this famous golden child. And he's to be sacrificed as a burnt offering, which is a sacrifice of atonement, on a mountain in the region of Jerusalem. As the story progresses, the son has the wood on his back, the father has the fire and the knife, the tools of judgment, and he's trudging up a mountain in the region of Jerusalem on his way to become a sacrifice of atonement, this one who is the seed of Abraham, who is the heir of the cosmos. Abraham says, we will worship there and then we will come back to you, which the New Testament picks up as he seems to have some kind of trust that through sacrifice and out the other side, somehow, the chosen one will come back to us. And obviously in that moment, the angel of the Lord, intercepts judgment and says, now I know that you fear me because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. And he provides the ram in the thicket as a substitute for Isaac, the promised child. And so on that occasion, the ram is sacrificed, but Abraham had said a lamb will be provided. And so the whole thing ends with verse 14. Where is verse 14? So Abraham called the name of that place, this mountain in the region of Moriah, the Lord will provide. And it is said to this day, on the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided. What shall be provided? The lamb, the true son, the seed of Abraham, the heir of the cosmos.
Yeah, Jesus.
And they knew which mountain it was going to be on. And so this is a Christian way of reading the text, but I think it's a Christian way of reading the text that it is utterly consonant with the Hebrew details. But the way that Christians read Old Testament texts is not that, oh, here's an injunction. Abraham was told to do this very strange thing that, as you say, the Lord says, it never entered my mind to think about human sacrifice in the past. And yet, narratively, we are being told something about Christ and Him crucified. And this is the way that Christians read Scripture, right?
Yeah,
not as Abraham was told that, so I guess I can kill my son.
Of course, yeah.
But and we take the details seriously and we take them through the cross.
Many scholars see this as kind of a mythological retelling of the story by which human sacrifice came to an end. The practice of human sacrifice got replaced by animal sacrifice because at some point in our anthropological history this occurs, and many people see this as
not in the Bible, but
they see this as an encoding of this in the biblical story. That this is what is described.
They're welcome, but within the world of the Bible, that's not the world that the Bible describes.
I agree. I think it depends how you're reading it, right? If you're reading it as a Christian, of course that's how you're going to read it. What I'm saying is it's too simplistic an approach. I'm demonstrating the simplicity in my very own approach there.
Okay.
So where we've got to is that you're just aware here, Alex, that there's a number of different factors that might go into the emergence of the values we have around kindness and compassion in today's world, and you're not in any way dismissing the fact that Christianity was an important motivator in various aspects, but you're questioning this whole idea that it's too simple to say it just came out of the Bible. The Bible is a very complex.
The problem is not one strange verse. The problem is the whole moral pattern. In Genesis 22, Abraham is praised for being willing to kill his son because God asked. Christianity then turns the death of Jesus into the center of salvation. Hebrews 9:22 even says, "Without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness." That is not moral progress. That is ancient blood sacrifice thinking, dressed up as compassion.
Not just that, but also that, like, we talk about compassion, and compassion is such an ambiguous term that, by the way, obviously does crop up in other traditions, to the extent that if you're just talking about compassion, you can't be talking about something which is uniquely indebted to Christianity. The thesis is more specific than that. It says that our modern sort of conception of Western values comes from Christianity. So I don't just want to know where compassion... In fact, if I were just to grant that, okay, this idea of compassion, maybe even, the idea that all human beings have the imago Dei and they've all got worth for that reason, and that's what gives us this, antithesis to exposure and that kind of stuff. We're talking about Western values, right? And when you say Western values to somebody, and you say, well, what are the principal values of the West? If you were to ask a scholar or you to ask someone on the street, what defines Western values, you think? Do you think that they would say compassion, consent? Maybe they'd say equality, but I think they'd say things like this. And I wonder if in listing some of these things, you can think, or perhaps provide, and people listening at home can think of what might be a biblical or church tradition grounding for any of these things. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom for free sexual encounter between any two consenting adults. Free market capitalism is really important to the development of the West. The military and colonialism, nationalism. These are the kinds of things which I think actually define the West of the past few hundred years. And I don't think any of them have a grounding, let alone a unique grounding in Christian principles.
Oh, goodness. I mean, certainly the first five things you mentioned are unthinkable without having come through centuries and centuries of Christianization. Was freedom of speech the first thing you sort of mentioned? I mean, that was absolutely hammered out in Protestant Catholic disputes. John Milton coming very strongly for freedom of speech, and then from dissenters from the Church of England wanting to have the freedom to be able to, express their own views, and eventually sailing across to America and there you see some profoundly Christian history behind, why does America have a First Amendment that, the United Kingdom does not? It's the sort of question that you cannot answer without consulting Christian history and Christians doing things that they've certainly interpreted them as acting for Christian purposes. Yeah.
I mean, I was going to move us on to equality, which I feel is kind of part and parcel.
Okay,
of this
I think it's
conversation.
worth pointing out. I guess briefly, I would consider that in the same way that you might use something like the abolitionist movement, which you would see as sort of, which we'll get onto shortly, I'm sure, but like sort of, emerging in a Christian culture, like fine, but there are sort of two theses here. It's either that you've got this sort of Christian worldview which exists as the biblical stories from which it grew, and then the early Catholic Church, and then you've got the Protestants coming along, and you've either got this story of like a flourishing of Christian values into freedom of speech, or you've got this story of a kind of disintegration from this original idea that you certainly don't get ideas of like freedom of thought and freedom of religion and freedom of speech from the Bible. Right? You can be put to death for believing, for worshipping the wrong thing. Right? We definitely cannot ground in the Bible the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of religion.
In theology, the difference between speech and violence. Like on a naturalistic worldview, is there a great difference between speech and violence? Whereas on a theological view, like the idea that Jesus says, "Put away your sword, for those who live by the sword will die by the sword," and then the only sword he gives to the church is the sword of the Spirit, a spiritual sword. What is that? It's the Word of God.
Yes.
And then the idea of missionary encounter all throughout medieval Europe was to go armed with persuasion.
Yes, I think you write about that in the book as well, right?
I think that is part of the intellectual genealogy.
What I'm trying to explain here is that I see sort of two stories here, right? Like, if freedom of religion, as we sort of consider it today, is essentially a Christian idea, which I find extremely strange, reading the Bible in particular, then it would make sense that it sort of develops over the history of the church. But if freedom of religion is actually a sort of a principle which is asserted against the Christian tradition, we would also expect it to come as sort of at the, like somewhere in the story of going from a sort of a fledgling Jesus movement into an early church, into a Protestant Reformation, and then as people begin to sort of wane on the authority of Christianity, they then start establishing these principles for themselves. And I think you've described exactly how these things did come about. People sort of began to realize that their own interests weren't being served by the church in the case of the Protestants, and they decided we want to be able to assert our own views here. Same thing happens in America, where there's disputes between churches and state, and Jefferson famously writing about the disputes that they have, and these are put in place, these protections, as much to protect the church as to protect the people who are sort of trying to not attend that church. But like, I think what we're seeing here is a sort of disintegration and an assertion of your own sort of self-interest, essentially.
I mean, if I were to try to summarize this, Ali, is it that you're concerned that Glen is passing off as quote-unquote Christian, things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, not because it's tied inherently to the biblical witness, but because the circumstances that happened historically around the church led to people developing these ideas, not necessarily because they somehow find their seed in...
Especially, I know that Glen has a lot to say about the concept of rights, and it's true that you get sort of talk of rights and conceptions of rights dating sort of back to sort of the 11th, 12th centuries, maybe even prior to that. But clearly the kind of rights as are embedded into the Western framework today start to emerge.
Let's talk
in
about
the 17th and 18th century.
This is where I wanted to go.
And I think that those rights are an assertion of self-interest.
Okay.
They're not a flourishing of religious tradition. I think that they are essentially a result of conflict that people are trying to protect against.
We will come back to that. We'll put a pin in that and come back to, because I think this neatly moves us into the next area I was hoping to kind of get into, which is equality, another key value that Glen, you say, has its foundations in the Christian story. Obviously, your view is, and perhaps you can elucidate some of this now, that obviously that was worked through by theologians and the church and into what we might call a modern Declaration of Human Rights or whatever it might be, but that somehow that was unthinkable, as you say, without the Christian story that ultimately gave rise to it. Alex, I think we're going to hear why he feels that's a stretch too far. But make the case first for equality as a fundamentally Christian idea.
Christianity cannot honestly claim freedom of speech or freedom of religion as its own invention. Leviticus 24:16 says blasphemy deserves death. Deuteronomy 13 says even a family member who leads you to another god should be killed. That is not religious freedom. That is forced belief. Modern Western rights grew when people started limiting church power, protecting conscience, and separating law from religious control.
Yuval Noah Harari makes the argument that equality is a fundamentally biblical idea generated from a belief in God and souls. But he then goes on to say, but if we no longer believe in God and souls, then what do we do with this idea of equality? So I think that the thesis that Christianity has shaped our moral intuitions is made from lots of different directions. There are people who think Christianity has shaped our Western values, and it's not a good thing. I think Tom Holland, for instance, is the sort of person who thinks, oh gosh, I do believe in the human rights thing, and I now see the dependence upon the Christian thing, and if I might as well be hung for a sheep as for a lamb, and so I'm going to dive into the Christian thing. Now, that leaves me with the job of, is there a link between Christian faith and equality? Declaration of Independence. So in June of 1776, Thomas Jefferson writes the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be
sacred,
except
and undeniable.
Yeah, sacred and undeniable. Exactly, sacred and undeniable. So he sent that.
That's the first draft.
That's the first draft. He sent that out. Benjamin Franklin put 6 lines through sacred and undeniable, and just says self-evident. And I think that's a perfect description for the ways in which we have moved from an explicitly Christian understanding of something like equality or rights, and moved towards a purported rational basis for these things, which I think has smuggled in what are properly Christian ideas under a kind of an Enlightenment, secular humanist.
I mean, the self-evident decision by Franklin to put self-evident instead of sacred is essentially that move to the air we breathe. It's, oh, of course it's self-evident, because this is the air we breathe. Why would we ever have to imagine that this has a supernatural basis? But you're saying it did have a supernatural basis.
Well, I mean, he didn't edit out that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Thomas Jefferson...
The Creator wasn't in Jefferson's original draft.
Is that right?
That's right. He does say created, but he doesn't say creator, which is kind of...
Creator. So who added creator? So
it was Congress or something. I can't remember who it was who did that.
There was a secularizing and a more religifying...
remember that bit of Hamilton, but I don't... Anyway.
But... Okay, so I mean, Jefferson is getting this language from John Locke, who is arguing right back from Genesis chapter 1 and from the image of God, Genesis 1 and 2, from the image of God. The Enlightenment thinkers were originally much more explicitly Christian than they ended up being. And you see in that process from John Locke, who... is just explicitly biblical in his framing of human rights coming from a biblical understanding of the image of God, from Locke to Jefferson to Franklin to today, when we all just kind of assume that, these things are self-evident. And yet, I would say the one thing that's self-evident about rights is that they're not self-evident. And if they were, they would be much more widespread in human civilizations around the world. This is why Tom Holland, in his book, says, the ultimate seedbed of the American Revolution was, no matter what some of its framers might have thought, the book of Genesis. An Old Testament book, right? A book that I think we're very glad exists, and that has been at the heart of the rights revolution.
When you talk about the book of Genesis, are you really just talking about chapter 1, verse 27? Or is there anything else in Genesis that you think is relevant here?
Well, the entire creation narrative is a radically different narrative to either the religious ancient Near Eastern conception of the day.
Specifically, what is it that uniquely contributes towards this, flourishing in the Enlightenment from Genesis?
That we are made A, in God's image, and B, to have dominion. And so both those things are important in terms of our inherent worth and dignity, and in terms of the fact that God did not make us to be slaves, but made us to rule, which was very important in abolitionism, which we might get to.
There's a lot to say. You track this back to John Locke, for example. What were we just talking about? What did Locke think about atheists? He thought that they couldn't be trusted. He thought that you couldn't make like legally sort of binding agreements with them. He thought like so much for freedom of religion, right? Like that certainly
is that a bad thing, or you're stating that as it?
I'm saying that like we were discussing a moment ago, this concept of freedom of religion as a flourishing of these ideas, and that obviously didn't apply to John Locke. Of course, by the time you get to the American Revolution, you have men in a room writing these declarations and these constitutions who at least themselves did not see themselves as engaged in a Christian project. Jefferson is famously not a Christian. He's famously anti-Christian.
Yeah, him and Franklin were the two least Christian men.
Gouverneur Morris is the same. The man who wrote the words. He also put a pen, but this time to the Constitution, which is the actually legally binding one, which originally opened, we the people of New Hampshire, New York, and so on. And he put a line through it and said, "We the people of the United States of America." And he was once asked what he thought the hand of God was in forming this miraculous Constitution, and he said it was the work of plain, honest men. He didn't recognize such a thing. Perhaps the most important founding father might have been Thomas Paine, because Thomas Paine is the one who got this whole thing going in the first place. A lot of people didn't really want revolution. They just wanted proper representation in Parliament if they were going to be American subjects of a British rule. But Thomas Paine is the one who convinced everybody that actually we need revolution. We need to assert our rights. And we know that Thomas Paine was not a friend of Christianity. He writes thoroughly against Christianity to the extent that he had to live in exile. And then when he finally died, his bones were lost, and no one wanted to come to his funeral. He was
once asked what his philosophy was. It was to act justly, love mercy, and work for human flourishing. Right, and you'll recognize that act justly, love mercy is Micah chapter 6. And then he adds the sort of the humanistic gloss to it. I think that's another perfect example of some profoundly Christian ideas that have just been...
But these men at least saw themselves as working contra Christianity.
Yeah, they might have seen themselves as that.
And you could say that maybe you have a better sort of grasp of their psychological motivations than they do, but I think
when they say rights, they are showing us the intellectual genealogy, and it runs right through the heart of Christendom.
Yeah, because I want to talk about rights, but that's kind of I suppose that's a separate subject, because we're talking about equality here, right? And when I hear the word equality, I'm thinking equality between whom? Like, in what context do equality come up? They come up in things like racial discrimination.
Yeah.
They come up in things like gender discrimination. And there is...
Jefferson held 600 slaves as he wrote that.
And there is absolutely no way that you can look at the Bible or the history of the church and think that there is... I think even in embryo, the idea of something like our modern conception of gender equality that's indebted to a feminist movement.
The equality claim collapses fast. Genesis 1 gets used as proof of human dignity, yet Christian scripture kept clear ranks. Slaves obey masters, women stay silent in church, and women are denied authority over men. Jefferson could write, "All men are created equal," while enslaving over 600 people. That is the real pattern. Religion preserved hierarchy, then later tried to take credit when reform movements forced society to widen equality.
So people of Tom Holland's ilk like to say that the feminist movement is essentially Christian in origin, and I think that the justifications for such a view is essentially roundabout. So why don't we focus in? Most people today, when you ask them, do you think that men and women are equal? They don't just say they both have equal worth in the sense that neither should be killed. They don't just say that they have equal worth and that, if you have a child, you shouldn't, abort one just because it's a woman. They say that there's a sort of equal societal standing of men and women. And I'm wondering if you can identify where in the Christian tradition that comes from.
What they want to also say is difference, right? And the culture wars that are tearing us apart are, how do we affirm both the difference of male and female and their ontological equality?
It depends what you consider to be like the Western position on the equality of women.
And it depends what you consider to be the feminist movement? Because there's not just one
Yeah,
feminist
right.
movement. Like, are we on wave 5? Or like, which wave are we on? And it just goes to show that actually difference and equality is really difficult. And it's not as though the year 2025 is the utopian, we're at the Platonic ideal of how to relate equality and difference. And in fact, things are going back and forwards with Supreme Court rulings.
But you understand what I'm driving at, right? Like famously, Paul, who is the most important early Christian writer to the extent that his letters, and some letters that were probably not written by him but claimed to be written by him as well, found their way into the scriptural canon and explicitly tell us things like women should remain silent in churches. If they've got a question, they should go home and ask their husbands, for it's a disgrace for a woman to speak in church.
Which within the same book, so that's 1 Corinthians 14, isn't it?
That's right.
And then earlier in chapter 11,
Talking about prophesying.
it's women praying and prophesying. So either Paul is contradicting himself within 3 chapters, or, but perhaps the word gune, which means wife and woman, is that's what he's saying.
What's he saying?
That there was a problem within Corinth. Worship services were an utter zoo. You have people speaking in tongues. You have people getting drunk at communion. And were there wives speaking over their husbands as they were preaching, right? And he's like, we'll sort that out at home, okay? I think that is the sort of interpretation of 1 Corinthians 14 that actually makes sense of 1 Corinthians 11.
I disagree with that, of course, I disagree with that. I think the interpretation that makes sense is that Paul didn't write that verse and it found its way into the scriptural canon as a mistake because somebody had read 1 Timothy 2:11 onwards and was making a note in the margin and it found its way into the text. It's the only part of Paul's letters which move around in early manuscripts. It's really interesting. There's a lot of really good scholarship on why that wasn't actually written by Paul. Interestingly, I, as a skeptic of the biblical tradition, am able to absolve Paul and say Paul was not a sexist because he didn't write those words, whereas the Christian has to own them. It's in there. It's part of the scriptural canon, right? It doesn't just say, and by the way, you could say, right, this was, like Timothy was written to like a church in Ephesus, and you had like the cult of Artemis, and there were women who were taking authority that wasn't rightfully, like maybe, but we don't have that. We've inherited a scriptural tradition which has quite clearly been interpreted throughout history as saying that women, for a start, certainly can't hold church office. Now the Protestants changed their mind about that, but I don't know how they square that with what's in the scripture. What I'm saying is that like, you don't think that the inequality between men and women might have been somehow bolstered by these kinds of biblical injunctions. I mean, Paul also
You
says
don't think that the reason why we are so interested in gender equality in the West has anything to do with Christianity?
It depends what you mean by anything to do with Christianity.
Well, okay, so we've got this scripture.
Because I think that when you look at the history of rights, you're not looking at a blossoming of Christian tradition. I think what you're looking at is people beginning to assert their own self-interest. I mean, the case in point for this, right? Like if you want to look for a sort of archetypal origin of rights talk in the UK, it's going to be Magna Carta, right? If you look at the Magna Carta, what happened? Like there's this incompetent king who the barons are all really upset with and he's charging them too much money. And so what do? They show up with their swords and they say, you have to stop doing this and you have to agree to abide by the certain kind of rules that we're all going to agree to and you're going to be below the law. And the king with, 500 swords in his face goes, okay, fine. And that's where you get the birth of rights. It's not a bunch of people sat around having, meditating and praying and going, you know what, I think that God would want us to have these rights. And the same thing happens.
If the gender equality concerns of 2025 are important to you, in which culture or civilization would you rather live? One that has a Christian tradition behind it or one that has not?
Well, it depends. I mean, what other kind of traditions are you talking about?
Well, there's Islam around the world.
Well, I wouldn't like to live there.
There's a very venerable tradition.
I think I wouldn't mind living in a Buddhist tradition, for example.
In terms of gender equality, in terms of rights speak, in terms of
it's not the same kind of right speak. In the
it's
same
not
way,
exactly,
right?
and that's really the thesis.
But do you think, for example, that the feminist movement, women having the right to vote, representation in power, even being allowed to run for office as well in the first place, do you think that would have happened, would have gotten off the ground, if women themselves hadn't just tried to assert it for themselves? Do you think, in other words, if they'd have done what the Bible tells them to do, and to essentially stay silent and ask their husbands at home, instead of coming out and saying, we've got something that we want, and we're going to throw ourselves under horses until we get it.
Female suffrage.
Do you think that men, on their own, that like Christian men of the Enlightenment era would have just sat around and gone, you know what? You know, it's been hundreds and hundreds of years that we've been Christian, and I think, and there's all these verses that we've been, but I think we've been getting it wrong, and I think we should give women the right to vote. Do you think they would have just done that on their own because of the influence of Christianity?
Listen, I mean, just read through the book
without the protests of women.
Read through the book of Acts, and you will see Philip's got his 4 daughters who are all evangelists. You have Priscilla and Aquila. She is named first in this house church. She is correcting Barnabas when he's going off on one. He gets to the end of the book of Romans, and Romans chapter 16 is just talking about all his co-workers, and there's women everywhere. There's Junia, who is outstanding among the apostles. There's Phoebe, the deacon. This is extraordinary. And so taking that trajectory and moving it forwards, I think the most obvious explanation for why universal suffrage has had a Western intellectual genealogy is surely Christianity.
But, like, as in, do you think those were the conversations that men of their own accord were having? Like, absent the protests of women who were getting fed up with their material conditions, you think that men were just sitting around having these conversations going, you know, Junia and Phoebe were really important, and, you know, Paul seems to say that she's an apostle, and so maybe we should give women the right to it. Like, you think that would have just happened without the assertion of people? Like, I think that
but I think that's fine. The assertion of, you know, female agitation for female suffrage is wonderful.
But I'm saying without that, you think that it would have happened? You think that it would have been successful? I think if you look at the history of rights...
But you seem to be assuming that the only kind of person who would agitate for female suffrage would themselves not be driven by Christian convictions. What's your evidence for that?
What do you mean?
Well, you seem to think that I would have a problem with suffrage coming because there were women agitating for the vote. I don't have a problem with that, and I don't see how
they were doing so because they were sort of going to church and learning that they should emancipate themselves from the pulpit.
Well,
rather than just being a bit fed up with the material conditions that they found themselves in.
Oh, I think it's both.
I mean, so for example, the only time...
all women
let Glen just...
all women everywhere might be fed up with patriarchal societies. Who has overturned patriarchy more than Western societies?
If Christianity naturally produced women's equality, women would not have needed centuries of protest to get basic rights. The Bible says women should be quiet in church and should not hold authority over men. Women won the vote by organizing, marching, writing, and refusing to stay silent. Religion did not hand them freedom. They had to fight past the systems that used Scripture to keep them under male control.
And is it? It seems to me that the default position is, when we look back at our Christianized history, when we look at other cultures and notice that they have not had those same developments, you might imagine that there is some alternative history that could have got us to where we got to. But that seems to me an implausible story, and that seems to me an untestable story. The story...
Yes. I mean, so I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just saying yes, because one of the big problems of this is testability. But I want to talk about that, but I really just want to sort of... There are all kinds of reasons why this could have only happened in the West. You know, it might have had some... I mean, I think that a lot of the development of people's individual rights, their ability to begin asserting them, had a lot to do with technology. You know, like feminism in particular. Really importantly, some of the roles that society could not do without.
The washing machine.
Exactly.
Transformed feminism.
So much, right? And so it's easy to say that it's because, you know, they were going to church. I mean, if that were the case, why didn't they do it 500 years ago? Why then? That happened to coincide with technological developments which allowed them to get out on the street and protest, right? Now, we might then need to talk about the scientific revolution as to why washing machines were invented in the first place, and we're going to disagree on that. But I really want to, like, just drill down here and think, like, I think that people who are living in oppressive conditions will have a motivation to, when they have an opportunity, try to overcome that, regardless of whether or not they're Christians. The only time in history that there's been a successful slave revolt on the level of a society, whereby, like, slavery has been overthrown and a new government and colonialism thrown off and slavery abolished of their own accord because of their own revolt, is the Haitian Revolution. It's in Haiti, right?
Yeah.
I do not think that Haitians were living in slavery under colonial rule and they were kind of okay with it. And then they started thinking about Christianity and read the Bible and decided, you know what, now it's time to rise up. I think that there was enough in the in the disutility and the preference against the conditions they were living in, that when they saw an opportunity, they seized it and did so successfully. And I think that that is the history of rights. I think that Magna Carta is a result of barons holding swords to the king. I think that feminism is a result of women saying, we don't want to do this anymore. I think that slavery is as a result in the Haitian Revolution of the slave.
In the Haitian Revolution.
But in other cases,
Yes.
it's the development of photography. Think of the importance, and not solely, but think of the importance of poor Peter, the lashed back, the image that shocks everybody, right? Like it's not as simple as just saying that some people started thinking about Christianity and going to church, and that's what motivated them. Because if that's the case, why did it take so long? And why did it coincidentally come along with the Enlightenment? You know what I mean?
Okay. Should we go to slavery and abolition? Is that, or is there something you want to say before?
Let me just, I won't add to that. I'll clarify. I think one thing my book, The Air We Breathe, doesn't really do is the sort of technology shock stuff. It doesn't talk about material conditions, which is a lack. And you might get the idea that these 7 values kind of float down as Platonic ideals and just embed themselves in Western values. It was a lot messier. And, your description of Magna Carta is a good example of, 5 steps forwards, 4 steps back, bloody, mixed motives, technology is playing a part, enrichment is playing a part. So I totally take that. Nevertheless, all those sorts of vicissitudes of historical conditions are happening everywhere in the world. And it seems to be...
but you asked me that question, isn't it? Why within Christendom did this happen? Where, around the time of the Enlightenment, 16, 17, 1800s, where were the most, where was the most technological development happening?
Well, China, right?
Oh, okay, all right.
Look, but seriously, China. I mean, the ships, in China,
the ships aren't really doing much for the material conditions of.
Well, they could do if they used them. Unfortunately, like the New World explorers did for resource extraction and that kind of thing.
If anything, that the development of better ships would make the slaves have a better time under the boats, right? I'm talking about the kinds of material condition, the changes in material conditions that were relevant to the assertion of rights. I don't actually know where the washing machine was invented, but I would guess it was probably in the West. I don't know that for sure, but I just think it is extraordinary to think that there is this history, thousands of years long, of textual evidence of the differential treatment of women, and a church history of the differential treatment of women, and a society which has historically been quite brutal to women over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds
compared to
and
what?
Hundreds and hundreds of years.
Compared to what?
Compared to what we think today.
Okay, but
now, when that finally happens, Christians want to turn around and say, oh, that's because of Christianity. That's because over those hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, nobody realized that this was what was really being gotten at all along. And this just so happens to coincide with the technological revolution and Enlightenment thought.
Enlightenment thought, rights predates Enlightenment thought.
Not really. Where do you think rights come from? Where's an early source of rights?
Let's allow Glen a chance to sketch out a bit of historical detail for why you see Christianity informing those Enlightenment values.
I think that 11th, 12th century canon lawyers doing the flip side of our obligation. So I have an obligation to a poor person, and that is for the person in power in order to serve the person who is powerless. In the 11th, 12th centuries, you start to get the idea of the poor person has a right to sustenance. They are entitled, right? And that starts to be a discourse that is developed through the medieval period, to the point where somebody like a John Locke, coming along sort of post-Reformation, is speaking in these absolute terms about the rights of man that are grounded in natural law. They are getting all this language from medieval theologians, like 100%. Now, what we have nowadays, and something that is not a universally positive development, is that rights are now considered separate from obligations. There's all sorts of discourse around rights as a sword as opposed to rights as a shield. The protection of the weak seems to be the origin of this idea of the inviolable worth of this person. So this person's rights cannot be traded off against the communal greater good. And so rights as a shield was very much at the heart of things. I think this is another example of ways in which Christian intuitions have been taken in post-Christian directions, in ways that are unthinkable without Christianity, but are not what Christians are saying.
Why do you describe those as Christian intuitions? You're talking about like the strong not oppressing the weak?
That there is an inviolable and inherent dignity to each person, such that their rights cannot be traded away. Yeah, that's a Christian thing.
I mean, I feel like if you broaden rights to be essentially rules for the sort of protection of how people engage with each other that are based on, you know, a prohibition on the strong being able to oppress the weak, you've got the prologue of Hammurabi's code. Quite explicitly, that's what it says. It says that this is such that the strong shall not be able to oppress the weak, and then you've got a load of rules about how people are to engage with each other.
Yeah, and then you've got laws that are different depending on what part of the social strata you're a member of.
It's true, but also in the same way, when you want to talk about, like, you know, rights talk beginning to exist. Like in your book, you talk about the Gregorian reforms, which I think you place too much stock in these reforms as being like an origin of rights talk. But even if they are, you're not talking about rights universally. You say, well, it's enough to say that we're beginning to get these inklings of the kind of thing we're talking about. Well, that's what I'm just doing with Hammurabi's code. And you're saying, yeah, but then if you look at the details, I'm saying, well, look at the details of the Gregorian reforms. It was mostly about, you know, like enforcing celibacy amongst the priesthood and saying that secular authorities aren't allowed to, you know, institute clergy members. That has to go straight to the Pope. In fact, it was sort of a reassertion of papal power, which is, I think, quite against the democratic principles which people consider in the West in terms of structural governmental organization. So, like, yeah, I think, in other words, this whole thing, I think, is an overemphasis on Christianity and an underemphasis on other potential influences. So when it comes to something like Hammurabi's code, or when it comes to, I don't know, the Hippocratic Oath, which even today people refer to as the sort of foundation of medical ethics, years before Christianity, thousands of years before Christianity, you have the Hippocratic Oath, or rather, thousands of years before the developments that we're talking about, I should say.
Right.
You have the Hippocratic Oath, and what does it say? It says that whoever's house I walk into, rich or poor, male or female, I am to serve them. Now, I have absolutely no doubt. Now, I'm not going to say that means our modern Western ethical medical tradition is indebted to Hippocrates, who probably didn't even write that. But I have absolutely no doubt that if that prescription showed up in the letters of Paul, that Christians would be jumping on it as evidence that our modern medical ethic is completely indebted to Christianity. And I think it's just overemphasized.
Rights did not fall out of church doctrine. They were forced into the world by people who had power used against them and finally had the leverage to push back. Hammurabi's code talked about stopping the strong from crushing the weak long before Christianity. The Hippocratic Oath gave doctors ethical duties before Christianity. The Haitian Revolution ended slavery by revolt, not church permission. Religion keeps trying to crown itself as the source of progress, but history shows progress came from pressure, evidence, and resistance. So here's the question. Did Christianity give us Western values, or did people build modern rights by fighting against religious and political control? Comment your answer below. There is more to this debate, and trust me, it gets way more heated and crazy. Comment more Alex, and we'll keep debunking this debate together. Don't forget to like and subscribe.